Ever since John Hammond and the Milwaukee Bucks struck gold by selecting Giannis Antetokounmpo 13th overall in the 2013 NBA draft, it's been a trend in the NBA and in the scouting community to try and find that next diamond in the rough type player that will emerge out of nowhere to become an MVP caliber level player, failing to recognize that the reason why the Giannis story is so impressive is because of its improbability. Although the concept of an international man of mystery prospect predates 2013, that's when I personally started following the draft relatively intensely, and it's when the Giannis thing exploded and that draft archetype set a precedent. And since then, guys like Thon Maker, Sekou Doumbouya, Alexei Pokusevski, Ousmane Dieng, and Tidjane Salaam, to name a few, were all selected in that similar mold for the upside that they presented, while having impressive frames to pair with the possibility that they could convert their moldable raw talent into superstars. And the problem with this archetype is that it doesn't typically work out. And the guys I listed are examples of players that have not worked out. And teams think that taking a swing at a player like this is worth it, especially with high selections, higher than they might have been selected by other teams, and when they might have benefited from selecting a valuable role player instead. As a general rule of thumb on this channel, I personally tend to prioritize the projectability of a solid floor in prospects who might have that role player upside instead of a difficult to reach high ceiling, with a player who might just be completely out of the league quite soon. And for Noa Essengue, I feel similarly, but I do also want to say that I see the vision on him more than usual. While in the past, I was out on all of these earlier prospects listed, I think Noa Essengue can be actually a productive NBA player and is kind of an exception to this rule that I kind of abide by as a scout. Although almost certainly I don't think he'll be at that Giannis level. And, I think people are getting a lot more intelligent with the draft, and there's been a cool down after the Giannis thing. So I think actually a lot of people are recognizing this as well. However, I do think that there are people in this draft cycle that have already started to rave about Noa Essengue and likely have him very high on their draft boards and in their mocks, describing a player that could be rather than, a player that is. And, Essengue is not the next Giannis, but he could be a valuable role player, and that's why I like him coming into the draft. People tend to romanticize the raw European prospect, but as I like to do on this channel, like I said, we'll be talking about what Noa Essengue might be more realistically, and even though I'm also kind of falling victim to the upside play here, there is a world where he becomes an all-star or whatever, but when I get into the film, I will be pretty critical, so I just want to say, I do like him being that potential valuable role player, but, it's very unlikely he's going to be a star, as with a lot of guys in this draft. And, although he didn't get his measurements taken at the combine, a year and a half ago when he was just 17, he clocked in at 6'10", with a 6'11" wingspan, and he's currently only a few days older than Cooper Flagg, which makes him the second youngest player in this class. And the French-born player had a key role in the German team this past year, and actually the reason why he didn't get measured at the combine is because the season's still going on. He currently is the starting center for this team, and they're matched up against Alba Berlin in the playoffs. And although, like I said, he's a starter, an important piece of a winning team, I want to preface by saying that despite all the negatives I'm going to point out in the film and with the statistics, the intel that I've heard says, by all accounts, he's a hard worker, has a great attitude, and that's promising for a guy who has a lot of work to do. I don't think that he'll probably contribute to a team right away to any major or even moderate capacity, so he'll need to be focused and dedicated on his craft to progress in the league and fight for minutes. And as we'll get into, if he can polish some of the raw skills, better grow into his body, and overall just put it all together, we could be seeing Noa Essengue being an important player down the line and perhaps someone that contributes to winning. Okay, so let's actually get into the film. So in my opinion, the marquee skill for Noa Essengue is his ability to finish around the basket, and especially in transition. Like I said earlier, he was the starting center for and it's interesting to see that the versatility he projects to a finisher from various spots on the floor. And of all players I've scouted in the past few years, I think that Noa Essengue is the most interesting transition player I've done a deep dive on, and he shot nearly 80% from the field in transition, which was in the 92nd percentile per synergy. And what makes this even more impressive is that on this efficiency, he was in the 77th percentile for volume, which means that not only is he getting out and running more than most, but he's by far finishing at a higher rate than the field. And so combining the great volume and the great efficiency paints a picture of an unstoppable force in transition who will probably continue to find success in the league. And a lot of this comes from his willingness to get out and run in transition. Noa Essengue has such a good feel for when to get out and run, and he's quick enough to outrun the other side. He loves the transition, as you can see with the clips, and he'll just start bolting as soon as he thinks a turnover may occur, let alone if he caused one himself. Sometimes this guy even outpaces the cameraman, he's so quick, and the other wing or center guarding him usually isn't able to keep up because they don't have the timing or the expectation that a transition is going to occur when it does. And he pretty much dunks everything as well, which is super helpful in being efficient since he doesn't have to slow all of his momentum for a layup, which is something I am kind of worried about him with the touch, and it also avoids getting blocked. I definitely think he'll be able to get this done in the league, especially during the regular season when the effort level is a little bit lower, and as a driver, the volume is quite low with average efficiency. And to be honest, I actually think that he moves kind of fluid for his size and for his age here, to be honest, but I'm not entirely sure if I'd want him to be a driver in all honesty. But once again, I don't think guard skills are entirely necessary for him to be successful in the league. And while being able to drive isn't necessarily a guard skill, I more so mean that I don't think he is going to need to be an on-ball creator or create shots for himself to be a successful player. I know a lot of people are going to think that is what it's going to take for Essengue, but I think him, finishing as a transitional piece, finishing around the basket, doesn't require that he's a feature part of an offense. I think he can be a play finisher rather than a play initiator. And I think Essengue can be very successful, like I said, as this play finisher in this role player mold, which plays right into his prowess in transition. Most of the time, his best work is by only having the ball for a few seconds. And in transition, he's an easy target for lobs, dump-offs, or outlet passes that force him to make simple plays. And this is where he thrives. He doesn't steal the ball too much, but I do think that when he does, he's not entirely strong enough to go straight through someone on a drive or even put a hook shot over a shoulder. He's not, his frame just doesn't complement that yet in or in the NBA for that matter. And we'll get into the jumper, but I was surprised to see that he had a very effective post fade, which is promising considering the lack of development that I'd want to see in the jumper so far. But he's shown a nice drop step, and I think that if he can put on some weight and try to be a 4-5 type of player instead of a wing, I think it's the best decision for him as he goes to mold his career, because you look at a guy like this type of prospect can go any number of ways in the NBA, but hopefully a team will empower him to become that 4-5. And the drives definitely reveal, at least in my opinion, that I think this is where he's headed as well, as his lack of strength definitely shows when he takes these elongated scoop layups that, although sometimes work, show he needs to add a lot to his frame. And there's no real way that these types of moves succeed in the pros, and I personally think he should stop doing them. Another thing that he has really going for him is his work rate, though, and his ability to nail putbacks and crash a glass to get second chance points is exciting for me. He's a more than capable offensive rebounder, and so his motor lets him get those easy buckets close to the basket. And in general, I'm a fan of his touch around the rim, and that motor in transition and gunning for putbacks will make him an effective opportunistic scorer at the next level, which is a key component of being a good role player. And these skills are easily lauded by teams. I'm sure he'll impress a lot of scouts with things like this, and a lot of guards will be happy to throw him the outlet or the dump off. But depending on where he falls in the draft, he might have guards that are more reserved about setting him screens or giving him post touches or letting him drive. Depending on where he falls, I think teams are going to decide how he progresses, which makes me think that his first team might not be his best stop. You might see him having a flourishing career on a second or a third team, because he's the type of guy that, since he's so moldable, how a team approaches his development will inevitably determine how he performs. And as you'll see throughout the entire video, my reasons for liking Noa Essengue is his ability to fit in the short term, and with someone of his age, who knows what can happen long term. And I think for now though, his finishing package shows some certainly translatable skills to the league that'll make him a valuable asset to a team and an attractive prospect in this year's draft. Okay, so given his strong measurables and his fluid movement, you would expect Noa Essengue to project as at least a solid defender. However, the stats, and honestly the film as well, make it a complicated picture. Per Synergy, Noa Essengue was in the 19th percentile for defensive efficiency, and that's surprising once again given his tools. While his interior defense does seem solid from the film, and he's a 49th percentile post defender, the at-rim numbers are quite promising. Opponents shot 44% from the field near the basket with Noa Essengue as the primary defender, and I like this as something that he can continue to grow with as he hopefully adds more weight and tries to figure out who he is. The real issue for me at least is how he defends on the perimeter, which in terms of defensive versatility is what a lot of scouts are banking on and what they're hoping to see with him. He hasn't quite grown into his body yet, as I've been saying, in terms of coordination, but since he's so young, it's definitely possible. And this characteristic though does lead him to get blown by pretty frequently by opposing guards. And he can easily be put in the blender by different dribble moves and running around screens. And so this limits that picture of versatility that I've been talking about in this video and that I will continue to be talking about throughout the video, and that scouts as well have been talking about with him. And I think him being just generally raw in terms of footwork and things like that is a big part of this. Not necessarily a mental issue entirely, but it does lead him to be rather undisciplined and easily beaten by guards. And I wanted to see him, like I said, clean up that footwork defensively and also just stay in the fight when he gets beaten. I think he gives up a little too often for my liking, and as someone that I said earlier has a high motor, this once again complicates what I think about him. However, I do wonder if he might give up on the play because he averages over 2.5 fouls per game, which is an extremely heavy foul rate, so maybe he's just trying to be cautious. But it does make me think that he doesn't have a good grip on the defensive end, which leads him to use his hands or get put in a disadvantageous position when trying to stay in front of someone. And Noa Essengue is also not a great team defender and gets lost in gaps so frequently. I also think that he overcommits a lot more often than he should, and probably more often than they want him to for his team, and it's not promising to see that he always seems to be running around in rotation, and so part of this is probably because of how Ulm is set up defensively, but Essengue is also often the final guy that misses that rotation and gives up a basket, unfortunately. But to be more positive, he does have active hands, and his burning passion for running the break has led to solid stock numbers of a steal per game and 2/3 of a block per night, and he's awesome in passing lanes, which, as we know, leads to very efficient looks for him on the other end. And I can definitely buy into his defense as an upside play more than an immediate play, because the tools are there, and the things that he can work on are pretty coachable. He can work on understanding rotations better. He can work on spatial awareness through film. He can work on not biting on fakes as much and not trying to overcommit as much. That is all fixable at the NBA level. It depends on his ability and willingness to learn these concepts, but I think it's possible. And so the film definitely shows, like I said though, that he has a lot to work on and a lot to clean up before he improves on, as a defender, and hopefully a weight training program plays into that for him. But, like I said, it's the film and the stats that complicate things. But when you think about Noa Essengue, who he is, as we'll show throughout the video, he truly does care, and you can see that he has this emotion throughout the whole game. But a lot of it for him on the defensive end is going to be, can he tap in to the tools he already has and clean up the raw, unpolished parts of his defensive game on the other end? Because, I think he can be a very high level, above average defender if he puts it all together. Okay, I know this is a long video, but I'm going to show a bunch of extra Noa Essengue clips. I think a lot of it's really indicative of the fact that he is a raw defensive talent, but you can see the flashes of him being somewhat of a transcendent, high-level, versatile defender. It's just he's got to clean up a lot of the issues with awareness, like I said, and then also rotations. But assuming he gets stronger and assuming he gets the footwork and the mental mapping of the court down, these clips will really show that. I personally think, although it's not there right now, it's the place for development that I am most confident that he can put together in becoming that high-level role player type of guy that I'm looking for with Essengue.
Timor skip pass to Marcus Foster. Marcus Foster cradles that one and he gives it up. Another turnover. Timor with the rock. Shakes free off the pass from Ginat. Now trying to find Motley down low as they have all quarter. Entry pass.
-5, vraćaju se gosti na -2. Valencija je su zabili u nizu, Putel malo prije toga i odija se.
The Raf finds a triple. A strong start to the second quarter, the youngster. It's Tanaskovic can't get it through.
Jedno mjesto ispod crte, 7. nisu ušli u doigravanje, u kojem je na kraju 26 pogreška domaćina.
Okay, so moving on from his defensive clips, I think one of my major concerns that I have for Noa Essengue is also the thing that probably gives him the highest upside, which is his perimeter shooting. On just under 2 3-point attempts per game, Noa Essengue shot right around the 30% mark, which leaves a lot to be desired on that end. And for a guy who's being touted by many as a beacon of potential and versatility, it's important to recognize that you have to shoot to be an effective NBA player if you're not one of those bruiser bigs. And I definitely would like to see him do well in some pre-draft shooting drills, whether it's in a workout or even in a pro day at the very least, before I'm going to come around to be convinced about his shot. However, I will say that the mechanics do both look good and repeatable, which is really important with a jumper. And he does shoot at a higher percentage, in all honesty, than a lot of the other bigs in this class that people are saying will be able to shoot in the league. So maybe I'm just pessimistic, but although the release is kind of slow, I actually do see the potential for it working out. Not only that, but the Ulm coaching staff has definitely empowered him to take these jumpers, and as the season progressed, he's gotten a lot more confident, and his percentage have been rising. They have him spaced a lot out in the corner, and that's where the bulk of his three-point attempts are coming from. As an off-ball mover, he doesn't really get a lot of screens set for him, and I haven't really seen him effectively step into shots much. So, for now, he's definitely a stationary shooter only, and, if he can become a movement shooter, that would be kind of insane. And so, I don't really think that's going to happen, but this inability to be a movement shooter is an indicator that he's not very far along with his jumper, but I also don't think it's a deal breaker. And in any event, being simply a spacer as a catch and shoot threat, I think that's fine, and I think there are worse prospects shooting-wise than him for sure in this class. And he doesn't necessarily have to be a knockdown shooter to succeed in the NBA. He probably just needs to be at least league average to be a role player. But I guess I do see a future with him at the very least holding space and being respected in the league. And not only that, but depending on where he lands, I think a proper shooting coach can get him up a couple percentage points. And so let's say, for example, he gets up to 34% from the field, from three. He's solid for a 6'10 guy. And looking at his misses, I think there's a lot that we can glean. I think it's actually fairly achievable for him to clean up some of these shots, as it's not like he's missing wildly. While I do think that a lot of his shots end up hitting the back iron, I wonder how a shooting staff can help him hone that in and try to be more fluid and more precise. And without knowing much about Noa Essenge's personality and him personally, his emotional disposition on the court does make me think that he does care enough to be a hard worker. And stemming past the catch and shoot jumper, I am pretty concerned about the long-term viability of his development as an on-ball shot creator. Taking a look at his dribble jumper specifically, I don't see this becoming something that an NBA team will allow him to do as a pro. He's super raw, especially with dribble pull-ups, and I think it's because his handle isn't intact enough for him to drive, stop, and then transition the ball into a shooting motion all in a short span. And this is something that I observed last year with Cody Williams in my video about him, and that obviously hasn't gone too well for him to start. But for the most part, any dribble jumper with Noa Essengue is essentially a prayer. And like I said, it's not a requisite for him to succeed in the league. He doesn't need it. And he's had some bad misses throughout the entire season with And, I wouldn't say that the shot selection is too awful, but, when he does take these shots, it is concerning. He kind of only has two real moves, though, which are the sidestep three and the pull-up mid from the left block or the elbow. And like I said, with the defensive end, it applies on offense. His court mapping isn't the greatest either, which leads to some weird jumpers that are contested where he could have passed, or some jumpers that probably could have been layups for a guy who's 6'10", but in general, I'm not a fan of him as a long-term shot creator, and he also doesn't really look to swing it that much, so if he is going to try to create for himself, I think he can benefit from, maybe adding some new moves. But I think one thing that I think he should add if he's going to try to make the jumper a long-term thing is lift up his leg to create space for a fade, and since I think that can buy him enough space and enough time to be slower with his jumper, and also make great use of that size to create awesome separation. And in general, I think scouts are overly optimistic about something that is more likely than not going to not pan out in terms of Noa Essengue, which is his shot creation. And so I think a realistic outcome for him is that he simply becomes an average floor spacer, which is fine. But who knows, maybe he could develop it. I'm seeing small flashes, but nothing significant enough for me to be optimistic about it developing for him. I think at the very least and on average, he'll be someone that they respect and is a league average jump shooter.
Gotovo je sigurno uzeti poziciju broj 2, sumnjam da će to propustiti, a možda se upustiti u borbu sa Bayernom za...
Charges forward, then just hooks on the brakes to now Colley's.
Essengue za 3 poena, precizan je Noa Essengue.
So in terms of on-ball playmaking, I'm not exactly convinced that Noa Essengue will even be the 4th most prioritized player on ball for an NBA team. And to be honest, that's okay. I'm trying to paint him as someone who will be a complementary piece and not this Giannis guy. And so it's fine if he can develop as a role player who doesn't need the ball. What I do see, however, is someone who at the very least will not be a major liability with the ball in the regular season, and we'll see come playoff time how things develop for him. But As long as he doesn't have too much of a heavy load and can develop as this role player early on, I think the development path for him could be positive with the ball. However, his film from the German league does give some insight into why I'm worried about his development as a ball handler. Although his 11.2% turnover rate is considered to be quite low and it's one of the lowest on the team, he still had more turnovers than assists for the year, and this negative assist to turnover ratio leads me to believe that they just didn't empower him to make decisions on the ball, and the film gives me solid reasoning to believe why that is. One thing that sticks out to me, which should stick out to every scout, is that he racks up a lot of turnovers from charge calls. He draws a charge foul all the time, and it's actually a pretty remarkable issue. You know, we've talked about his knack for wanting to run out in transition and be aggressive, but sometimes it goes way too far and he'll bolt down the lane with no regard for where his opponent is, and that kind of ties into his problem with court mapping as well. And a lot of players in the German league have been able to effectively scout this issue, and they often just throw themselves in front of him and draw this charge. And too often does his inability to map the court mentally lead him to pick up a cheap foul and a turnover. And this happens often enough for me to be really concerned whenever he lowers his shoulder and runs through the lane with a head of steam. And I think a lot of the issues from him comes from him being super raw and lacking that fundamental base to avoid sloppy play. Other than from charges, a lot of his turnovers can come from carelessness or poor footwork, and especially in some actions like him being on the block and doing a DHO, he's usually in awkward positioning, which gives him strange angles and thus gives a defender an easy passing lane to jump. And not only that, but Noa Essengue too often projects a pass as well, which makes it even easier for the opponent to steal. And I think that in the league, coaches will hopefully empower him to involve himself in these actions, but take away the pitch pass and replace it with a tighter handoff that leads to a screen. Once again, he'll need to get stronger for this to be more prevalent for him, but at least this way he can get downhill as well, or fade out for a catch and shoot jumper, which I'm confident will develop like I've been talking about. But these are the types of actions that, in my opinion, will lead Noa Essengue to find success in the league. And on the positive side, I am a fan of his instincts as a passer on top of his willingness to get his teammates involved. You know, it's not like this is a Tijan Salon situation where he just takes ridiculous shots and never passes. Seriously, watch Tijan Salon's clips from the French league last year and you'll see what I mean. It's why I was so low on him last year in that draft, because of his really bad shot IQ and feel for the game. And I think that's where Essengue somewhat differentiates himself from Tijan Salon and becomes, in my opinion, a better prospect. He wants to contribute to winning and doesn't try to be the hero. You know, sometimes he will make mistakes that these young, raw prospects make, but for the most part, I think he tries to fit into a roster, be a good teammate, and you can see that through his occasional good decision-making paired with his eagerness to make the extra pass and get his teammates involved. Sometimes he overpasses, I think, where he could be more patient or look to score, but you'd rather have this than what Tijan Salon does. And I think I'd like to see him become more of a screener as well, but in general, I'm at least hopeful that he won't be a complete negative with the ball in his hands, and I like his potential to be a more high IQ player down the line, and maybe a tertiator creator down the road, but for now, it's a work in progress, and it really depends on what happens when he gets to the league.
Essengue, kakvo dodavanje za Karima Jalova. Za 4 minute. Sulajmon je drugi strelac budućnosti sa 6 koševa.
Essengue Vajdeman od ploče pored.
Ovo je iscurilo. Probat će sada tricom i zabit će očito ovo malo prije.
Lasso Jensen στον Βάιντεμαν, Essengue σωστά έξω Hands, Pick and Roll, rüber, Essengue, extra Pass, Klammer, hat ganz viel Platz.
So in general, I'm pretty excited about where Noa Essengue is going to fall on my inevitable final big board, because to be honest, I'm probably going to end up being someone who talks himself into him rather than talks himself out of him as the draft approaches. And so, given his strong measurables and his movement, there's a lot to love. And so even though I was pretty critical of Noa Essengue throughout the video, like I said in the intro, I am in fact optimistic about what he could be. As a pure athlete, his ability to get out and run in transition, whether that's via passing or receiving, finishing attempts, there's a lot to love, and it'll be appreciated by NBA teams. And if he can clean up things like weak footwork on both ends of the floor, I can see him working his way into rotations sooner rather than later. And like I've been saying, I love the idea of Noa Essengue as a valuable role player who can run the floor, space a little bit, and eventually give some versatility on the defensive end. And this is a very valuable player, but obviously not the Giannis type of guy that everyone's going to look for with his mold. But given the wide range he has on mock drafts and online scouts as big boards, I really don't have a preference, a reference for where he might go. I definitely do have a preference, which I'll get into, but given my evaluation so far in the draft cycle, I'll probably expect to have him anywhere in the early to late teens on my draft board. And I think teams that might want to select him are going to be those rebuilding teams with multiple first round picks and have him be a part of a young unit, rather than a winning team who theoretically should be looking for a fresh out of the box contributor, because I don't think Essengue will be that. I do hope that teams don't give up on him though right away if he doesn't immediately pan out in the league, because we've seen those types of stories many times over where a raw young prospect exploding with potential will fall out of the league and then have a resurgence a few years later, and some of them end up not having resurgences, stay overseas and have successful careers there. But as guys who return, I'm thinking about people like Dante Exum or Chris Dunn, for example, and I don't want that to happen for him, because I think there's a linear path for him to success in the NBA that doesn't include him losing a contract or a roster spot. And with Dunn and with Dante Exum, these guys obviously have had completely different profiles than Essengue in terms of body type and who they were coming into the league. But let's remember what brought them back to the league is them getting a new position and a newfound ability to shoot and defend. And these skills are pretty much a non-negotiable for role players in today's NBA. And so for Noa Essengue, it's going to be a requirement for him to stick around. And in terms of ceilings, I'm not going to give him that Giannis ceiling that I'm sure you're hearing from other scouts, but I'll say the best outcome for him is that he becomes a high-level winning role player. And I think that's certainly attainable. And this is a valuable thing, like I've been saying throughout this entire video, that will provide him with an extremely lucrative NBA career. And as for the floor, it's very possible he doesn't make it to his second contract. And I think an average projection for Noa Essengue will show that he can be reasonably expected to be somewhere in between these two. And I personally think that a standard Noa Essengue career has him being a moderate contributor to a winning team and is a chess piece in a team's rotation. Not necessarily an integral component that any single team in the league will have playing for them, but someone that comes in and has his minutes shift given the matchup or the quality of team that he plays for. you know, depending on where he is. Maybe he won't play all the time for, say, the number 1 seed in the East, but if you shift down to the 7th seed, he could even be a starter, that type of player. And so overall, I think now that we have the full draft order and thinking about what his realistic fit would be, but obviously considering how high his ceiling is, I think realistic fits for him that are solid and I wouldn't mind him going to are Portland with the 12th pick, Atlanta at 13, Washington at 18, Brooklyn at 19, and Utah at 21. And obviously there's a chance that, you know, he impresses a lot in the pre-draft process and flies up in the mid-lottery, because that does seem to happen with some players each year, especially in this high upside mold. But I'm not sure if I realistically see it happening this time around. But in general, despite my criticisms of Noa Essengue, it's largely a reaction of how this type of player is treated by the scouting community and by the league at large. So, you know, given all of the positives I've outlined, I can't feel too bad about criticizing him in this video, and I am genuinely rooting for him, but for guys like this, you just never know. I think there is a chance he succeeds, but there's just an equal chance that he doesn't. And so with a guy like this, it's tough to project, but I hope if you made it to this point, you know, you're at least agreeing with me to some extent, because I think evaluating guys like Noa Essengue is a very valuable process for someone who is trying to learn about scouting and try to get invested in the draft. So thanks for joining on this journey. Not all my videos will probably end up being this long, but for Noa Essengue, I'm hopeful.